Welcome to Sustainability Now, solutions to shape a world that works. Designed for everyone interested in responsible stewardship of the planet, covering food, energy, housing, water, waste, health, economics, and consciousness. Welcome to your community, Sustainability Now, with your host, Scott Billy.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Sustainability Now. Wanted to start by giving a shout out to Lorna, Yasmin, Terry, Bill, Elena, and Annie, our latest patrons over on patreon.com/sustainabilitynow. We are totally self-funded and we really appreciate all of your help. So thanks for helping us keep the lights on. And today I'm really excited to talk to Chris Marquis about sustainable economics. He's the Sinyi Professor of Management at the University of Cambridge. And he's here to talk about his new book, The Profiteers, How Business Privatizes Profits and Socializes Costs. Chris has spent a lot of time focused on academic research and how it can help people around the world addressing big problems like climate change, inequality, and discrimination. He's also written a couple of other award-winning books, Better Business, How the B Corp Movement is Remaking Capitalism, and Mao and Markets, The Communist Roots of Chinese Enterprise. Welcome aboard, Chris.
Great. Super, Scott. Thanks so much. Really enjoy being here.
I love the title of The Profiteers, and I was curious what it was that prompted you to write this latest book.
Yeah, that's a great question to start out with. I wish all my interviews would start out with that, because it really will orient me to telling the positive side of the story. You know, I'm actually much more of a person that's optimistic, thinking about reform. Although the positioning of this book, you know, very much because I do dive into a critique of the system, but also I think publishers like to have real provocatively framed titles. But so this idea of the profiteers is about how business is really taking from the public common. And, you know, I'm sure we'll probably talk about that in a bit, but the idea around this actually came from many of the sustainable businesses that I study that are thinking about creatively and with innovation, actually internalizing many of the costs that other companies might actually be happy to, you know, once they leave the factory gates, have it be the customer's problem or society's problem or the environment's problem. So really it was the entrepreneurs that I've been studying doing things the right way that made me think I should write about this book that's about the sort of wrong way, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, well, I think part of, addressing any problem, the first thing you've got to do is define what it is, because it's hard to get agreement on a solution if nobody agrees that there's a problem.
Right. Good. Yeah. And I do think, you know, a lot of the writing on this topic, I also am a little critical of that. You know, it's very much about like, you know, getting profit from your purpose, or win-win of sustainability, or you can do well by do good. And certainly there are cases where, you know, you could possibly, you know, do well by do good, or win-win, logic holds. But I think, you know, most of the work looks in that direction without actually digging into what the fundamental problems are that maybe should be solved. And so that's one of the things I try to do.
Yeah, and sustainability now, we've got a really broad base definition of sustainability. You know, we're talking about everything from food, housing, water, waste to economics and consciousness, because if these things don't work together, they aren't really sustainable. You know, you can't come up with environmental regulations that are never going to work economically, or you can't come up with economic incentives that are the hell with the environment. So it needs to work hand in hand. And one of the things that's come up a lot, and we have our bi-weekly live get-togethers on Zoom.
Sure.
A lot of times we wind up talking about companies that are, you know, ought to be doing something different or whatever. And one of the key features, and what drew me to the content of your book, is, you know, we're driven by the idea that it's I always say the plague of the quarterly earnings statement. If you any decision you make that isn't driving profits up and for the next quarterly earnings may not ever see the light of day.
Sure, definitely. And I think that in many ways is, I don't know, sort of the animating force behind my critique. You know, this idea of needing to have short-term profits is what really very narrowly focuses on companies on the type of value that they aim to create, very much just delivering short-term quarterly earnings, and they then externalize a lot of these other costs. And I use that term externalize, sort of actually not a very good, but not a very good sounding word, but it actually is encapsulated, I think, well in the subtitle of my book, how business privatizes profits and socializes costs. So a canonical example nowadays is really carbon emissions and air pollution. You have the situation where for most of history, or at least sort of industrial type, history, when companies, produced something and sort of had or manufactured something, had sort of smoke going out of their smokestacks. I mean, that was free for them. There was no charge, but there's actually cost to that. There are health costs to the people in the surrounding communities, who might get respiratory illnesses or other, sort of respiratory issues. There are obviously sort of other environmental, climate change costs. Those costs are things that, if companies were not so short-term focused, they could actually think like, well, is it responsible for us just to be, spewing or treating the skies as a free airfill for our pollution? So it's it's those kind of issues that I really dig into in the book.
Yeah, and one of the ones that comes up all the time for me is packaging and the waste associated with consumer goods, because they're making the profit and forcing us to find through municipalities or private waste hauling. We pay for the disposal of the packaging for their products.
Right. And it's crazy, actually, to be honest, if you think about it. I mean, I think it's natural. It's become almost natural that we think like, okay, once we take a product into our possession, it's sort of 100% our responsibility. So we should be, responsible for throwing it, disposing of it, hopefully in the right way. But that actually has been, there's a project in some way of the packaging and beverage and other industries to really make consumers think that it's their issue, instead of the producer's issue. Maybe should take some extended responsibility, or think about the materials used, or think about sort of the extended life of that product. So back in the long time ago, when I was growing up, I remember we had a milkman, and we would get milk in glass bottles and put them out the next day, and it was a very sort of circular type system. There was not really packaging. Maybe a little bit of foil went went around the lid. And also around those times was a commercial titled that speaks to this exact issue you raised. It's referred to as the Crying Indian title. That's sort of very politically correct, referring to a Native American person. But so the commercial, for those of you who haven't seen it, if you haven't seen it, you should actually take a look at it, and I'll give you the sort of the punchline in a second. So it's sort of shows a Native American in a canoe, sort of going down a river, and then he sees all this trash that is sort of strewn on the banks of the river, and lands his canoe and sort of climbs up a little bit the hill and sees he's next to a highway, and there are people throwing their trash out of the cars as it goes along. And the voiceover says something like, people start pollution, people can stop it. Well, turns out that ad was actually produced by an organization called Keep America Beautiful, which is not some grassroots, sort of interest group. It's actually a group of packaging industry, beverage company, and other people who were really trying to divert attention from the fact that they were making all this disposable packaging now at the time, and they don't want to have the onus on them for responsibility they want to actually put the onus on individuals in the population. So I think it is a situation where, yeah, a lot of this waste, we've been sort of, misdirected into thinking it's all our individual responsibility, when really it should be the company's responsibility, or at least in part the company's responsibility, or they should create systems and think about how to reduce it and eliminate it.
Yep. And I feel like that needs to be addressed before the solutions will ever be put into place, because,
Sure.
this feel-good commercial that, back in the day, people were just throwing bags of trash out their car windows.
Sure.
It felt like, hey, let's all do our part and stop throwing our trash out the window. But it
Right.
had much more insidious roots, where it was just trying to, I often use the word, just kick the can down the road so that we don't have to
Sure.
address it today. And then even with recycling, people are doing recycling, they're doing their part. Some of it gets recycled. And in the case of plastics, a lot of that stuff was getting shipped around the world and still is. China doesn't want it anymore. The single stream recycling that we've set up here in the US, the plastics have, become so contaminated, they're virtually useless. A lot of times they wind up just going to other countries with less environmental regulations, where they can actually just burn them to heat the facilities rather than recycle them into anything purposeful.
Exactly. I mean, I think this is another, thing. I mean, yeah, recycling rates, I don't know, under 10%, which again, you see commercials like, there's one commercial that's sort of particularly annoying to me. You have this very cheery, diverse group of people from Pepsi, Coke, and Dr. Pepper saying, we're competitors on so many things, but we're working together on recycling. And it's like, they know that recycling doesn't work. I mean, certainly PET bottles can be recycled at a higher rate than 5%. But like you mentioned, it's all mixed in with all this other need to be recycled. So very low rates. And instead, they should actually be thinking about not trying to convince us that we should be recycling and they're good players because they're trying to work together on this, but actually thinking about redesigning their processes, redesigning their products. And I think that is sort of misinformation around costs is also something I try to highlight in the book. These externalities are not neutral, actually, but they're shaped through lobbying, through PR, through communication, so that we don't even realize in many ways that, we're basically footing the bill of profits, which actually if Pepsi or Coke are able to reduce their costs, that means their profits are increasing.
Yep. And even if the recycling that they're promising was working 100%, they're not paying for it. We are.
Right. Yeah.
And we're
Yeah.
paying
Right.
our local taxes to have a trash truck or a recycling truck come by,
Right.
and then supporting a facility that's going to go do something with it. Pepsi and Coke haven't done anything to contribute to that equation at all, other than the PR campaign that you just talked about.
Exactly.
Yeah. Kind of crazy.
Yeah.
I was curious to know if other countries are in the same situation as us. We talk about that shareholder primacy and how all corporate decisions need to be made at the benefit of the shareholders. Is that common throughout the world, or is that a uniquely U.S. scenario?
It's sort of interesting because I work in the UK now. I now get invited to do things in various European countries, and I'm trying to be very sensitive to not be like the American that thinks America is the center of the world. So, and a lot of the examples and I guess sort of understanding the institutional system that I have is based on America. So I will usually try to investigate a bit what the sort of norms, regulations, et cetera, are in other countries. And surprising to me that around the shareholder primacy, it's pretty pervasive, unfortunately, around the world. Europe, certainly the UK and Australia are well known for being very aligned with those ideas. And even in Europe, like I went to Italy not that long ago to give a talk, and was, Italy has the reputation of being, sort of a little more laissez-faire, interested in, I don't know, enjoying food and wine and all those things, and not to characterize, not to stereotype them. I'm, tongue in cheek a bit. But so I looked, and actually Italy has stronger shareholder value protections in the Italian laws than the US does, believe it or not. Certainly some countries like probably Germany and France are known for having a little bit more communitarian type of system. But I think, the shareholder primacy idea has spread quite a bit around the world as a dominant way to organize in some ways, market logic in countries.
And it led to the formation and topic of one of your other books, the B Corps. We've actually done an interview with the people that founded the B Corp movement.
Right.
And maybe if you could touch on that a little bit for people that haven't heard of that before, and how it's become kind of a new approach to make sure that we aren't locked into making decisions solely based on profit.
Sure. So yeah, my first book was called Better, as you mentioned, the introduction, Better Business: How the B Corp Movement is Remaking Capitalism. And it actually pairs very well with this current book, The Profiteers, because, in the B Corp book, Better Business, I really put forward a lot of solutions that were designed by that community. And one of the things I want to say, and I'm a big fan of B Corps in and of themselves. However, what I think is even more important is that it's really a movement. And you have a series of, in some ways, tools and processes that have been created around measurement, accountability, transparency, corporate governance, that actually are used much more widely than just for B Corps. So that was a little bit of a preamble, I guess. Let me actually say what B Corps are. I should have maybe started with this to begin with. So B Corps, so there's about 8,500 B Corps around the world now, in 150, 200, maybe not 200 countries, but 150 countries definitely. And these are companies that are certified for their social and environmental performance. They have to go through a very rigorous, basically sort of ESG assessment that gets, in part verified and checked by analysts at B Lab, which is the certifying body. And if you get over a certain threshold, you can become a B Corp. There's currently about 8,500 B Corps in the world, started in the US in 2006. So that's where the most of them are. But in the UK, where I am, there's a very large community in Europe as well, Australia, Asia is emerging. Africa, still very, very small set of them. And, I think a movement, because, it's not just about these companies, but actually this group has also been influential in changing corporate law in many jurisdictions around the world. So, as of 2010, there was no type of company called a benefit corporation. So there's actually a new type of organization, legal company, which is different than the certification B Corp. And these benefit corporations actually, in their legal bylaws, actually have companies have a wider purpose with which they have to, sort of be accountable to, not just short-term shareholder primacy. So I think that's another important element, that this is about really creating the systems and tools that all companies can use. And there's hundreds of thousands of companies that are using the assessment tool, companies using this new type of law. It's not just in the US. Italy, France, a number of countries in South America, Rwanda in Africa just recently implemented benefit corporation legislation. So this is a way to more structurally reorient the company so that it's not as sort of adherent to those shareholder primacy principles. And I think it's really important. One company that's had a similar process to like you described with Patagonia is actually Whole Foods. I was just reminded this, actually. I was giving some talks on the book and someone actually asked me about this Whole Foods case. So Whole Foods, as folks probably know, is owned by Amazon now. Used to be a standalone publicly traded company. But for whatever reason, I don't remember the reason why, but there was some quarterly earnings issues over a period of time, and activist investors bought into the stock and basically forced the sale because of this, need to have short-term profit. The CEO at the time, someone named John Mackey, who's very well known in this broader space, really focused. He wrote a book on conscious capitalism and was active in starting that movement, which there's a lot of sort of chapters and people discussing conscious capitalism. He came out after the acquisition and said, I really wish that I had actually transitioned into a B Corp benefit corporation, because it would have given me the sort of ammunition or legs to stand on, so to speak, to push back against those shareholder, the people that were really just about shareholder primacy. And I think that's important because, conscious capitalism, and I've seen, John Mackey talk, and it's really amazing what he did. And I think conscious capitalism is a super important set of ideas and movement. But as he originally formulated, it was much more about culture and leadership. And obviously, clearly, culture and leadership are essential to be sustainable. But in many ways, they're sort of a necessary but not sufficient condition to have it sort of ingrained with the organization. I think where the B Corp movement comes in is that, in addition to, culture, purpose, leadership, it actually has a bunch of processes and tools that actually can help embed sustainable principles within an organization. So yeah, that's a little bit about B Corps.
One of the things I always latched onto is the triple bottom line of people, planet, profits. You can't just one of those things forever anyway.
Right.
It sounds really good in the short term when you're writing those checks out to your shareholders, but people in it need to work into the equation as well. And to set it up legally, I think, is the only way to really see it through. And I wonder if you could to touch on the idea of where, or it's probably some sort of work in tandem, but whether you see government mandates or corporate activism as, the driving forces behind these changes.
So I think it's, so sort of in some ways, the sort of diagnoses I make in the book for how to actually improve towards the end, say both are required. I think that in many ways, and I'm in a business school and I've mostly studied corporations, and that's a context the sort of innovation and activism companies I'm more familiar with. But to really move the needle on many of the urgent crises we have around climate inequality, probably just voluntary action and an activism of companies is not enough. I think it will be a small number of companies that actually engage in really true sustainable or regeneration. People are talking about it nowadays. Where I think that, and why I continue to really focus a lot on companies, is around innovation. This is something where actually finding innovative solutions to many of these issues is, it requires, I think, the entrepreneurs and innovative companies. So we talked about plastic a bit, and one company I profile a bit in the book is Grove Collaborative. They're a company, and they produce all kinds of various things around sustainably focused housewares and health and beauty products. And the CEO, Stu Landsberg, said to me once, he said, the focus of my business is on my biggest externality, which is plastic. And if you think about that category, I mean, it's a lot of liquids being shipped around in plastic, your dishwasher detergent, your shampoo bottle. And I think, many companies would just be satisfied with maybe incremental innovations, trying to reduce, maybe the size of the bottle or the thickness, or use more post-consumer recycled material. But he said, we set out a vision to actually eliminate plastic for our business, which is really challenging for that type of business. And so that created a lot of innovation. So for instance, shampoo actually you don't need liquid for shampoos. Actually, you can make shampoo bars. And they abandoned their liquid shampoos and actually, transitioned over to some, very effective, even award-winning products that don't need to be packaged in plastic. They can be packaged in paper or cardboard or something like that. Also, innovations within the company. So they set up sort of a pricing and internal sort of P&L around plastic for their business lines, so that actually their leaders were, sort of incentivized to actually reduce plastic within their business. And then also looking outward, they created a badging and sort of grading system around plastics in products, so that they could help consumers, better understand, what they were choosing and how that was impacting the environment. And I think, those are all really important ways to think about how to actually reduce this externality. Are they things that companies will voluntarily accept? Probably not. But would they have come to mind or come to the fore without a company like Grove Collaborative and others that are actually innovating? Probably not. And so this is where then I think policy can come in and help actually adopt some of these models and spread them. And I know, there is, work around, extended producer responsibility in plastic that has moved in recent years from one that is much more focused on funding recycling systems to one that's more in line with, Grove Collaborative, which is really sort of about avoiding plastic. And so, yeah, so I think I see sort of corporate voluntary action and policy as sort of a 1-2 punch. You get sort of innovation from one, scalability from the other.
Yeah, I know there's been a lot of movement on single-use plastic bans, and
Yes,
a lot of lobbying against it.
totally.
So yeah,
The
go ahead.
packaging industry is really something else. They're very, very tenacious. I wrote something. There's an NGO called Beyond Plastic that is very active in advocating for a lot of these issues in law and in state legislatures around the United States. And I wrote something, an interview with their executive director, and I was actually contacted by plastic industry lobbyists complaining about my article. It was the first time that it happened to me. So they're really they're tough.
Yeah, definitely. All right. Let's dig a little deeper into some of the individual issues and the types of externalities that you
Sure.
talked about in your book. We touched on carbon emissions earlier. Like, who really is bearing those costs if it's not industry?
I mean, so the carbon emissions. So I think, it's, like, for instance, it's the communities around wherever it's being emitted. It's actually the globe. I mean, carbon emissions, as you know, I mean, they could be being spewed in Africa or, Siberia or Patagonia or wherever, but, it's not a localized pollution issue. It's actually the global warming, it doesn't matter where it is. So really it's us as consumers that end up, sort of footing the bill. And I think that's, for a lot of these issues that I, sort of the second part of the book, I go through a set of different items. So the first one is mainly air pollution around carbon emissions. I also talk about, waste and damage to the earth. So waste and cheap goods and plastic and fast fashion. And I think that is something where, part of what I do is also then not just identify that, okay, you have this Shein that's making all this, really poorly constructed stuff that's not recyclable and labor conditions are not great. But actually, then there's actually a lot of companies as well that are working on, sort of circularity and ways of promoting much more sort of quality, buy less, more. One of the chapters that was interesting to do, and then really some of the feedback I got early on was from my editor, interesting, was on sort of the agricultural system and sort of sort of the system that we've created where farmers are basically debt trapped for the seeds. Things are produced with very questionable practices, both labor wise as well as an amount of sort of pesticides and chemicals. And my editor, when he read that, I didn't do a good enough job, I think, probably motivating it. He said, well, you should just cut this chapter. Who really cares about agriculture? And
Only
and
people.
so yeah, right, exactly. I mean, it's incredible. Or like where? Or I mean, it's really incredible. I mean, agriculture has really faded into the background of us, in the developed countries, but it's such an essential. I mean, it's about 25% carbon emissions, and it's for a huge amounts of products in our world. It's such an important cornerstone or material, comes from the natural world. And there's also all these issues with biodiversity risk nowadays. So that was really a chapter that I thought, I learned a lot by doing that. And I think, one of the things, again, on this issue of innovation that I profile a bit is work around regenerative agriculture. Mm-hmm. And so this has a lot of innovation in a number of different ways. So one, just very simply, innovation in capital provision. So various funds to actually help farmers move to be able to produce things regeneratively, because frequently they've been stuck in this system of these large, agrochemical companies that they make these seeds. These seeds don't, won't germinate. So it's not like in the old days where you could just, save some and then you'd have your seeds for next year. They have to, they only work one year. You have to use the sort of connected chemical like Roundup. There's famous sort of Roundup Ready seeds. So to actually get out of that system actually is quite costly. So there's a number of sort of financing innovations that are sort of trying to help those farmers make that jump, but also around standards and accountability. So, as it is now, not like organic where there's actually defined governmental standards. Actually, to claim something's regenerative is, anyone can say it. They could be using various chemical inputs or processes, and doesn't really matter as far as what they're saying. And so there's also been work from a number of private actors to put forth a system of a regenerative organic certification, which is both rigorous and comprehensive. And then, like maybe organic, I mean, this could then be like, it's innovating in the private sector, but then maybe can also be adopted later by certain governments, so that we don't have a lot of this misuse of the word, because all that does is sort of confuse consumers, as to what they're buying.
Yeah, it's always a little frustrating, the potential for greenwashing. Every time a new term comes out, people could just latch onto it. Lately it's been circular economy and zero waste. I've seen plastics commercials talking about zero waste recently, and it makes me insane.
Yeah,
it's literally never going to happen.
Totally. And it's interesting. I'm actually I'm the chair of I'll leave the organization nameless, but I'm the chair of a organization's environment committee, and I've recently took this position on, and was asking questions about sort of what happens to the waste. And someone said, we're a zero waste organization. It's we have a vendor that actually does this and manages this for us. I'm like, oh, that's very interesting. Let's dig into that a bit. So, what it is it's actually zero waste to landfill, but basically it means they burn most of the stuff. So, well, I mean, that doesn't seem like it's an optimal solution. So anyways, it's still early days in this. I'm trying to dig into where to sort of, have an impact or not. But yeah, there's a lot of terms that are bandied around, and in some cases, perhaps the way that they're actually implemented is not, is not what people that are reading things think.
I would challenge the assumption that burning first, it still creates zero waste to landfill, because that ash needs to go somewhere.
Sure, there you go. Maybe it's good they use it as fertilizer or something, although maybe it's plastic. So it's
yeah, I've had a lot of discussions about incineration over the years, and if you got the law of conservation of mass says that the what you put in there is going to come back out one way or another. It's going to come out the smokestacks.
Exactly.
With heavy metals, they're going to volatilize, and all the best scrubbers in the world aren't going to catch them. Or you're going to amass, and if you do have great scrubbers, you're going to amass all that toxic stuff that didn't come out the stack and put it in the ash.
Yep.
There was a famous Philadelphia incinerator ash barge that was circling the world trying to find some place to put its content, and nobody would take it because Greenpeace was ahead of them, warning them because it was a total toxic mess that they were trying to unload in different countries around the world. And then one time it showed up in a port empty, and apparently it just offloaded in the ocean because nobody would take it. So incineration isn't necessarily the cure to landfill.
Exactly. It's really, and then, we sort of rest on your laurels, and I mean, actually very low levels of recycling, which was, so anyways, it's I'm trying to think of the best way to actually intervene in that system. But I'll have to keep you posted.
All right. Yeah. So then I guess I wanted to move on to like the last section of your book is talking about the regenerative economy. And I figured maybe you could dig into that a little for us and explain what you're talking about there.
Sure. So, this term, as I mentioned, is being used a lot. And in some ways, has the danger of becoming some sort of meaningless buzzword. But then also, maybe it helps provide some sort of set of ideas about maybe reforming the economic system. So let me say a little about, I guess, what regeneration is. Sustainability, we all know about sustainability, UN Sustainable Development Goals. Frequently, that ends up being about sort of do less harm, or sort of more of a maintaining the status quo. Whereas the idea of regeneration is much more about, sort of repairing, restoring, renovating in many ways the, sort of underlying maybe a natural world or social world. And why I focus on that, because it actually has a nice sort of conceptual, sort of parallel to my the argument that I have around negative externalities. This is really very much about positive externalities. But also, I think it's important because it represents, in some ways, like a new way of thinking about business that a number of companies are starting to explore. So I mentioned about agriculture, and this is the area where it's gotten the most traction. Now there's the standard, the regenerative organic standard, which I mentioned. And the idea is that, by being thoughtful in agricultural practices, actually can leave the soil and natural earth better than actually when you started. This is so the idea of sort of regenerating. And where I begin to think about having this last part of the book really focused on that was actually when I was interviewing folks at Patagonia. And what they had told me is that actually when they got into the Patagonia provisions business, this created a lot of sort of thinking within the organization, because Patagonia provisions, although still a pretty small amount of sales, showed them that actually if you were thoughtful in agricultural practices, you could actually restore habitats and restore ecosystems, not just deplete them. And at the time, in Patagonia's vision statement was basically a statement to the effect of like, do as little harm as possible. And the fact that they were acknowledging in their mission statement that they were doing harm really made them say, is this exactly what we want to be is this what we want to be doing for our business? So, this started them on this long set of activities. I mean, they end up changing their sort of stated vision from we're in business to save our own planet. In their apparel industry, which is obviously I think their largest business unit, the entire sort of construction of their value chain, they sort of put this regenerative lens on. So from the materials that originally sort of formed the products, if it's natural materials, regenerative, sort of, really working at the high, post-consumer recycled content, through to sort of end use, they now, repair, they have secondhand marketplaces, they encourage people to buy less, but buy more and quality. So, this, I think, because in some ways it's a mind shift, or it's a mindset change, thinking about, how to actually run your business so that it actually creates positive spillovers. And it's a difference than what is currently considered as part of this, stakeholder capitalism idea, where stakeholder capitalism is very much about certain impacts to be it your employees or your community, which, probably are good things. I'm not saying that they're bad things, but it's not necessarily about like reforming the core business model, like the example of Grove Collaborative I gave you, or this example of Patagonia, where these organizations are really rethinking their core business and then how they can become, deeply regenerative. So this is where, this is where I focus.
And that's really that sea change that is going to take us from, doing less harm and, making thinner walled plastic vessels as the
right. Yeah.
sustainability goal, to that whole net positivity. What can we do that's going to have a positive impact rather than less of a negative one? And that's going to be a huge step forward as we, work our way into that world.
Exactly.
And you did bring up a concept of the commons, and I thought that would be a good thing to explain to people, the idea of what that is and how it works into this whole equation.
Sure. So this is really, I sort of tie this a bit to this, externality issue, because, really, and it's very much based off of the tragedy of the commons, this parable that, probably if we don't remember it, you probably learned about it at some point in the past, where, a variety of farmers are grazing their cows on the common plot of land. And they start to realize that, oh, I can bring another cow because this grass is free. And then over time, more and more people bring their cows, and they think they're, and they keep getting rich for a while, but actually with having depleted all the common resources from overuse, the whole system collapses and everyone ends up, sort of not as good. So this is the idea that actually, by not thinking about the externalities, be it carbon emissions. I mean, we see climate change, is an example of something where, we're having a lot of significant issues around the world, with, wildfires, other disasters, hurricanes, flooding, that, this is, from all these decades of not being conscious about the pollution, we're having this potential collapse, of our system. So reorienting from taking from the commons to actually giving back, is I guess a metaphor that I try to pull through the book.
Cool. All right, and we're nearing the end of our time here, so I wanted to make sure that we get an opportunity to give you the platform to tell our listeners what they can do to help out.
Sure. So, I mean, probably goes without saying. I mean, I think that being thoughtful consumers is really important, and this means, buy less, but buy a better quality. Don't buy Shein. I know that I don't think that any of your listeners are going to be necessarily buying Shein, but maybe their kids do. I know my daughter, it's hard to get her to actually care about these issues. So I mean, I think that continual thoughtfulness about consumers, both individuals, but then also, not in a preachy way necessarily, but in hopefully a thoughtful, constructive way to those with whom you have influence on. I do think, though, that in many ways, consumers, I mean, it's very easy to pass the buck to consumers and say, consumers are going to save us, or, consumers should be doing recycling, or, sort of carrying straws or bags or whatever, and all those things. Of course, we should all be doing. But I think also we need to think about ways of sort of activism ourselves to put the onus a little bit more back on the companies. And I think that, being engaged with policy, is a way to do that. And so, beyond, consumerism in this situation is not going to get us that far. We need to actually reform the underlying structures. And so, supporting political candidates that are engaged on the topic, and, helping with support of various legislative and other efforts, I think is another thing that's really important to do.
Yep. One of the big things we've been championing here at Sustainability Now is the Green Amendments movement. Are you familiar with that?
I'm not. I would love to hear about it.
The idea is there are now 3 states in the U.S. that have it in their state constitutions that every citizen has the right to clean air and clean water. You always hear people, saying, "Oh yeah, it's a right," but it isn't explicitly in 47 states. There's a movement going on to get that introduced into the Bill of Rights in state by state, to get to the, like the ERA, get over the hump and to the point where it can be moved to the national level as well. And I see that as a great strategy, because I've worked on environmental legislation in previous lives. I worked for a lobbying group called Clean Water Action, and we did a lot of great stuff 30 years ago, and a lot of it has been undone subsequently because they slowly, pull the teeth out of the enforcement, or change the rules along the way. And legislation comes and goes, but the Constitution is a lot harder to change once you get in there. So it's definitely something we've been working to drum up support for. There for the generations is the Green Amendment movement's main focus. They've got legislation up in, I don't know, it's like a dozen or so states right now, trying to keep it moving forward.
That's fantastic. That's great. I'm going to look into that myself. That's the kind of thing that I think is really, if you want to spend your time, I think that's a valuable area.
Yeah, definitely. And then how can people reach out to you if they have questions or want to try to speak at different events or locations?
Great. Yeah. So I'm pretty easy to find. I mean, my, website is my name, chrismarquis.com. I have, an email and page at Cambridge where I'm a professor. So you can always get in touch with me that way. I'm, think this work is super important for our future and world, and I'm very passionate about, communicating it. So, I would love to hear from any of you. Please feel free to be in touch, if you have interest in talking more, or having me talk to your organization or whatever.
Great. And we'll get all of your links and contact information up on the show notes page of our blog, sustainabilitynow.global, and also links over to where people can go and buy the books as well.
Fantastic.
Great. Any parting words of wisdom or questions that I should have asked you, but I didn't?
No, these are great questions, Scott. Really appreciate it. And really appreciate the opportunity to talk to the Sustainability Now crowd.
Right. Great. Well, thanks for shining a light on these issues. And just a reminder to everybody listening that working together, we can shape a world that works. Thanks.
Thank you for listening to Sustainability Now. Visit sustainabilitynow.global to find resources related to today's program. While you're there, pledge your support by making a contribution to help us shape a world that works. And remember to subscribe, share, and follow us on social media.